Hello, Sharon.
Hello, Sharon Golub. And by the way, I want to do a big shout out to Rabbi Marisa James, who organized all the photos for the slideshow that you saw.
How beautiful was that? Yay.
She did all the photos. And the posters that are hanging outside are a combination of posters that I brought back from Israel and posters that have been used in the New York City Sunday protests. So welcome, everybody. Is everybody in the Zoom room, Sharon? Yeah, yes, everybody's in? Okay, great. So we're going to start as usual. People will come in, and then the great thing is that this is recorded and now will become part of our CBST anniversary Oneg archives. Thank you. So we're on chapter 4. Yay, chapter 4. And this chapter is called Finding a Rabbi. And how fantastic is that we're discussing this at the moment that CBST is really diving into it for the second time. So good to be able to enjoy this history and thinking about it more deeply. And I'm delighted that Sabrina is doing this discussion as the current president of the synagogue, who's doing a very deep dive and thinking about searching for whoever will be the next senior rabbi. But tonight is about going back to 1990. So Sabrina, would you ask the first? And we're going to ask some questions. The format's the same. And then we'll open it up afterwards, both to the people who are here as well as to those on Zoom. If you have questions on Zoom, chat them to Sharon and she'll get them to us.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi. Wyatt, am I on? Yes, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am so honored to be part of this group, interviewing Roseanne and interviewing Art. When we started thinking about how best to approach this, looking out at the kahal I see here, and I can see a few of you guys on Zoom, I recognize that there's a handful of folks who are actually here in 1990 when this process was about to take place, right? But there are plenty of us who either weren't born, raise your hand if you weren't born, no, just kidding, but who either weren't born, okay, there's a few, or, right, they're still downstairs, or we're not at all associated with CBST. So I thought it would be helpful to start us off with, let's set the scene. Let's paint the picture of what was CBST like in 1990? What was going on? What was it? Take us back to the moment when the search committee was formed and you guys started your work.
Well, CBST in those days was an all-volunteer organization. I think the only employee, I think we had a part-time bookkeeper in the office who was recording stuff, but apart from that, everyone was a volunteer. All the committee chairs, all the board members, no executive director, no paid rabbi. We had some members of the congregation who were rabbis, but they had other jobs. No janitorial. Yeah, we had to clean up after ourselves, everything else. But, I mean, I still remember when I came to CBST, was in the fall of 1977, when I moved to New York, and it was like going into somebody's basement. They had just relocated from a different part of West Beth to the space that we were in for many years, but they hadn't renovated it yet. And it was, I mean, cinder block walls, low ceiling, dim lights. It was really like, you felt like the Romans in the Christians in the Roman catacombs, you know. I brought my parents to a service and they said, "Why are you davening in a basement?" You know. I said, "Well, you know, eventually we'll do something," and we did. We fixed it up, and it was pretty nice, but it was still a low ceiling, and it was still a tight space. We didn't have a rabbi, but there was someone who was sitting in the front row when I came in that first day. There was a woman on the bima, by the way, which I was kind of surprised by. I'd never seen that before. But there was a guy sitting in the front row who seemed to be the chief prayer, and who was going back and forth. This was Paul Merling. And so the people on the bima were leading the service, but he was sort of leading the congregation. But we had a volunteer religious committee, and I believe by 1990, Jack Greenberg was pretty much in charge of coordinating services and of convening the committee to discuss questions that would come up. There was a Talmud class that Rabbi Paul was leading. There were a handful of people who were sort of Paul's acolytes, who were the religious wise men of the congregation. And I say that advisedly because there were very few women. By 1990, there were a few more, but it wasn't a large representation of women. And In 1990, we were in the darkest days of the AIDS epidemic. There was no cure. There's still no cure. But now we have the antiretroviral, and we have people who've been living with this virus for 30, 40 years. But in those days, there was a great need for pastoral care. There was a great need for people to conduct funerals, to make hospital visits. We had a volunteer committee that was doing some of that, but you really needed someone with training to do that. And the big debate, and I'm sure Roseanne remembers this, the big debate was, do we need a rabbinic social worker or do we need a pulpit rabbi? And the big issue was that we were very proud of the fact that every Friday night we had a service. We had service leaders. We had people to lead the singing, people to lead the readings. We had people giving drushes. It was a very organized thing. I mean, Jack Greenberg did an incredible job making sure we always had someone up there who was capable of doing it. And it was working very smoothly. So a lot of people said, what do we need a rabbi for? We can do this ourselves. And we're very proud of being a growing congregation that's governing itself totally. We don't need an authority figure to tell us what to do. And Mel Rosen, when he became president, said, we are too big a congregation with too many different needs not to have a rabbi. He was very open about the fact that he thought we should have a conservative rabbi, someone from the conservative movement, which would have been absolutely amazing if we did, because at the time they didn't have openly gay rabbis in the conservative movement, and so that would have meant either someone who was closeted or straight.
They were barely ordaining women.
Yeah, they were barely ordaining women at the time.
They had just started ordaining women.
And so one of the things we explored very consciously was the idea of affiliating with the movement, because if we affiliated with the movement, we would at least have the benefit of their placement service and an established way to get the word out to potential candidates. So we had representatives of those movements that were willing to talk to us, and it was everyone except the Orthodox. They came down to CBST, they gave their pitch, they answered questions, and the congregation had an intense discussion, and we said we're not affiliating because we don't completely identify with any of those movements. We are too diverse. Any movement we joined that would have requirements that a part of our congregation would feel uncomfortable with. So we were going to go it alone. You want to add something to that, Roseanne?
Yeah, I think,
Roseanne, just hold it a little closer to you. Yeah,
how's that?
perfect.
Can you hear me?
It's
Okay,
really the Zoom can't hear you without it.
okay. Hi, Zoom. So I think art has gotten into kind of where we were in 1990 to a certain degree. I came to the synagogue in '83, and there were hardly any women, but Shami was on the bima, okay, as the Baltafila. There was a lot of tension between men and women in the synagogue at that time. It was still very much of a separatist time. We didn't have, the organizations were, either for lesbians or for gay men. There's very little that was together at that point in time. And in the synagogue, it was hard because we had the tradition from Paul and others of being more on the traditional side, okay, than the progressive side of Judaism at that point. So to me, it was interesting because when I got here, probably the biggest thing I did was to try and increase the number of women in the synagogue. And I found Liz at NCJW, okay, the National Council of Jewish Women. We went all around trying to find people and say, come to CBST. There are other places you can come to. So we started a feminist minyan, which was a totally different thing for here. And we didn't want to compete with the regular services, which started at 8:30 at night. So you had a lot of time to not compete. And so we would meet at 6:30, and we'd have our feminist minyan. Sometimes we had it on Shabbos morning, to explore a different way of being Jewish than we had grown up with, and to learn together, to explore God language in, feminine God language. So I think that whole piece started changing a bit when AIDS hit the congregation, to the extent that AIDS hit the congregation. And in truth, it didn't hit during the first years. You guys may disagree with me, but during the first years of the early 80s, it was not nearly as much. We lost a lot of major members in the late 80s and the early 90s. Yes. And I think that's when the men and the women started working together a whole lot more as well. So when it came to getting a rabbi, I don't know how many of you knew Mel Rosen. Okay, well, for those of you who didn't, Mel was big. He was tall. Ora used to have to stand on a chair to be face to face with him to have a conversation, okay? And he was a little imposing with being so big and so tall as well. And he also had a lot of experience in organizations and bringing people together. AIDS organizations, he was a hospital administrator, ran Helen Hayes Hospital for a while. And so when he decided that we needed a rabbi, it was really an interesting process to get him to calm down a bit, to allow the whole congregation to think about this and decide whether we all wanted it or Mel wanted it. And before I go on, I just want to note that Jack Greenberg, who was a member of our committee and was the head of the religious committee, is here. Okay.
We were just talking about you.
We were just talking about you.
I was just mentioning how incredibly wonderfully organized you were, that as the person who was coordinating the service and the scheduling and everything, we had someone on the bima every Friday night. Yep. We never missed a service.
3 people in this, right?
Yeah, it was a drush and a service leader and someone leading the singing. Yep. And it was an incredible feat of scheduling, and this is before the internet. This is before email. Yes. I mean, it was an incredible amount of phoning. Yep.
But we had trouble if we wanted to have 2 women on the bima. Okay, there were all sorts of complaints. All right. Too many women.
So sorry about that. So can you describe a little bit of the forming of the committee? Who was on it? How did it get formed? Okay. Talk a little bit about kind of the process of that.
I brought a cheat sheet because I was trying to remember who all was on the committee, and I had to go back and read chapter 4 and see there are our pictures, Roseanne and me, and then everyone else in alphabetical order.
Book, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great resource. But Mel approached me. He said, if we can persuade the board to authorize it, would you be willing to chair the committee? Because Mel and I had worked together. He had recruited me to go on an advisory committee at the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services for services to people with AIDS, because he was chairing it. And he knew me from CBST. And so I went on that committee. I was working with him. And he said, we work well together. Why don't you chair the committee? And I said, a gay man may not be the sole chair of this committee. We are a congregation of men and women, and the women need to be represented, not just represented on the committee. I think we need a co-chair of one of the really prominent, established leading women in the congregation, because this committee needs to have credibility with the whole congregation. And we asked Roseanne, who led services from time to time, who was very visible, who was a leading figure. And we felt she would bring great judgment. She's a professional. We wanted a committee of people who could interact with the kinds of candidates we'd be talking to, the whole range of people.
How was the rest of the committee selected?
The rest of the committee was selected by trying to find people who represented all the different factions and aspects of the congregation. For example, people will remember the phrase, the Strickler crowd. The Strickler crowd had to be represented. And we had to find someone who was part of that circle, social and synagogue political circle of R.D. Strickler. And we found Marvin Heldeman, who was a doctor, who later ran into trouble of sorts, which we won't get into.
We won't
but
talk about
but he
that.
was
Talk about that.
he was a very valuable member of the committee.
Yes, he was.
And he was willing to commit not to tell the Strickler crowd who had applied all the things that we said couldn't be public information. You have to remember the time. This was a time when gay conservative rabbis were not out. I'd say Reform, Reconstructionists, more people were coming out, but there weren't a lot. There were like a handful. We had a few rabbis who were members of our congregation who I don't think were necessarily out.
There were less than 10 out rabbis
Yeah.
in America then.
Right. So we figured for people to apply for this position was at once very courageous, but maybe even foolhardy in terms of their future careers.
Go for the foolhardy.
Well, unless we kept it absolutely confidential. So, we asked people who wanted to be on the committee one thing: they had to commit to total confidentiality. And Bill Fern was a highly respected member of the community and a leader, so we persuaded him to join the committee. I know Irving Cooperberg would love to have been on it, but we said, no, there's no way. Too controversial.
Right.
And,
Jack was
but
at the
Jack, we
religious
wanted the
committee.
religious committee to be represented, and we thought the religious committee should play a significant role in the vetting of the candidates and of whittling it down to the people who were plausible candidates. And then we had, her name then was Janet Sonnenstein. Now she goes by Shane Call, who's a teacher, Nancy Albert, who's a lawyer, Bill Waller, who was a past chair and a person in the business community. And we ended up with 8 people, 5 men and 3 women. And we decided that we were going to do everything by consensus. So it was okay that we had an even number, because we weren't going to recommend a rabbi by a 5-4 vote or a 4-3 vote. It had to be unanimous. So we did everything by consensus. We didn't really take votes. We discussed everything, and we came to an agreement about what we were going to do. And then we had to invent our process. And you want to talk about the invention of our process that we had?
Yeah, I mean, the process was really from nothing, because we had never done anything like this. We really did not have the ability to go to the rabbinical placement offices.
Yeah, none of them would have us.
They wouldn't have us.
Yeah.
So we had to figure out what we needed, okay? And we actually started, as I recall, with values. What are the values of the congregation that we want to make sure that the rabbi has? And we talked a lot about their ritual beliefs and what they would allow and not allow and feel comfortable with and not feel comfortable with. Because at that time, I think we had 4 different minions going on here. So, and each had its own flavor. And we talked about, rabbis in general are thought of as being authoritarian, okay, especially at that time, and that this congregation would never be able to deal with that, and that there had to be a way to have the congregation respect the rabbi while being able to be themselves. And there were concerns among us and among people that we met with, because there were meetings before we formed our small group, about everything from...
You mean meetings with the congregation?
With the congregation,
So
right.
talk a little bit about that.
I think there were 3, if I'm not mistaken, meetings with the congregation. They were Sunday afternoons, as I recall, large, and a lot of anger, a lot of people who just did not want this change. But Mel was pretty persuasive, okay? And so I think, people, when they were talking about why they didn't want rabbi, gave us some of the ideas of things that we had to work in to our framework. And so in particular, things about our sexual behavior, about monogamy, non-monogamy, people who might have a commitment ceremony, but not want to be monogamous, and how would that fit in, and how would the rabbi feel about that? So there were a lot of interesting conversations, to say the least. I learned a lot.
And so,
then talk about the process.
yeah, we came up with a job description because we felt we should send it out to people who inquired. And we came up with a questionnaire. And this became the infamous questionnaire that there were a lot of people who received it and said, I'm not going to fill this out. You know, and I think part of it was questions that maybe some people saw as intrusive or saw as the rabbi's domain and we shouldn't be questioned about it or whatever. And in addition, of course, none of the movements would
Well,
let
I
us-
refuse to answer a couple of the questions, because there was one question I remember, which was, what's your experience with gay people or something like that? It was like, so clearly, I was like, ooh, that's a little, I'm not going to go into that.
Well, the reason is we got...
Exactly,
we
you
had very
assumed a
few-
lot were going to be straight people, so, some of
Yeah.
those questions were funny for me, because they were obviously designed to test where.
All you had to
straight-
say is, I'm one of the tribe. And that would answer the question.
I did do something like that.
But you know, so we had the questionnaire, and then we had our big breakthrough, because the question was, how do we get the word out
Right.
that we're doing this search when none of the movements would let us do?
And it's before the internet.
Well, the point is that their placement services are for their congregations and for their seminary graduates, and they said, if you're not going to affiliate with us, we're not going to list you. We had a tentative commitment from one, and then they said no, it was vetoed. So Mel called a reporter he knew at the New York Times named Ari Goldman, who was the religious beat in those days, and said, come down to our synagogue, meet people from the committee, find out what we're doing, and maybe there's a story in this. And I remember meeting Ari Goldman with Mel at the CBST, and we gave him the tour. And we told him how the congregation ran and everything, and he thought this was fascinating. And so an article ran on the front page of the Metropolitan section of the New York Times, and I think was in the national edition, because we got over 100 inquiries as a result of that. Now, once
They
we...
were very interesting
Yes.
inquiries.
Once we sent out the questionnaires, we only got about 40 back, you know. But that was enough for us to handle, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it was very interesting because we got, we can get into, we got people who thought they were doing us a favor, basically, okay? That they were going to help us and heal us, and, you know, we deserved to have a rabbi, so they would do that. We had a number of people who were toward the end of their careers and thought this would be a good gig for a few years, you know? We had a fair number of straight women and men from all over the country, actually. I remember this straight guy from Wyoming, the cowboy, remember him?
Oh, the cowboy. The one who showed up with cowboy boots when he came to a service, yeah.
This guy he came to the feminist minion first, and Ora and I were there. We hadn't seen each other all day, so we, you know, when we saw each other, we hugged, we kissed. Fast forward later on, when I was talking to him, he didn't realize it was me. And he said, I don't know, these women were all over each other. I don't...
Yeah,
I
and,
said, well...
and one of the questions that we had asked them in the interviews was, if there's a disruption in the congregation during a service, how would you handle it? And he said, well, I'd take him out, you know. He'd take him out. He said that wrong answer, you know. But we had some colorful characters, and we also had one rabbi who really impressed us very deeply. He was a middle-aged married man with teenage kids, and he was so warm and so Hamish and so nice and so supportive. And some of us, especially the men with gaydar, were picking up these signs. Is he going to come out on our bima? And we're thinking, maybe that's not what we want for our rabbi. You know, our bima shouldn't be a place for someone to come out. They should either be out or not be gay, maybe. Maybe we shouldn't have a closeted gay rabbi in a gay synagogue. So, you know, we basically whittled it down. We had first interviews with a lot of people after we
Can
went
you
through the
describe a
resumes.
little bit how the committee worked? Obviously you didn't have Zoom.
We didn't have Zoom. It was all phoning and mail.
Yeah.
I mean,
But did you gather together to have meetings
Oh,
together?
yeah, we
had meetings.
We had a lot of meetings.
And to keep things confidential, we didn't have any meetings at the synagogue. We had meetings at people's apartments. So we all got to know each other's living rooms. at least the people who were living in Manhattan.
And in fact, all the mail went to your law firm, right?
All the
Or
mail
you-
went to my
or
office.
Your
I
office.
was at New York Law School then. And,
So that nothing would go to the CBST office because.
no
there's-
paper in CBST office. In fact, I don't even know what happens to the committee's files, whether I dispose of them. I don't think I turned them over because they had all this confidential information. So, we interviewed a lot of people. The initial interviews for people from out of town were on the phone. We did some traveling to see people who were speaking in their own congregations because several people applied who were congregational rabbis. What we discovered is we couldn't be really strict about the qualifications that we had adopted because I think we eventually came to feel that finding the right person was more important than being able to check off all the boxes. We wanted someone with a certain number of years of pulpit experience as a congregational rabbi. We ended up recommending someone who didn't meet our minimum, unless we counted her student rabbi days in Atlanta. But once we were convinced that we'd whittled it down to the finalists, that was the hard part. We whittled it down to 4 people, and it's not telling any secret. It's in chapter 4. We ended up with 2 men and 2 women as our finalists, and one of the men was gay, one of the women was gay, one of the men was straight, one of the women was straight. Although we had some doubts about the straight man, as I mentioned. But he made it to our finalist list, and it was an extended conversation, and eventually what really tipped it for us was, I think, the incredible impression that we got from hearing Rabbi Kleinbaum speak. First at the International Conference for Gay and Lesbian Jews, she was the keynote speaker on the Shabbat service, and that's when many of us, in San Francisco, many of us first heard of her there, and she hadn't applied. And we contacted people and said, get her to apply. We want her to apply. And she eventually was persuaded to apply after looking at our questionnaire and giggling, I guess. But, and then we went up to Connecticut, you recall that. We went up to Connecticut where you were doing a
I have to
guest
tell
sermon.
that story.
Yeah, you have to
This is
tell
one of
that
my
one.
favorite stories. I was the director of congregational relations at the Religious Action Center in DC. So 2 or 3 Shabbatot a month, I was on the road speaking about stuff, social justice and Judaism things in different synagogues. So they had asked if, again, there's no YouTube versions of drashas, right? You have to actually show up. They asked, Art and Roseanne asked me if they could come and actually hear me speak as a committee. And I said, well, as it happens, I'm speaking in West Hartford in a couple of weeks, so that's close enough to New York. And I said, but please, I haven't told the place I was working that I'm even applying, so I really need you to be confidential. Don't tell people why you're there. Don't say, oh, we were interested in hearing, because, and try not to be so visible that a whole group from New York City is coming to. So I'm sitting, it's a wonderful it's a Moorish Reform synagogue in West Hartford. It's really gorgeous. I don't know if you know it. Joyce, I'm sure, knows that synagogue. Huge, classical Reform. I don't remember the name of it, but I'm sitting up on the bima, because I'm not leading the service, I'm just giving the drash. So I'm sitting on the bima, and they were all, the 8 of them, 8 gay Jews from New York City, coming into a classical Reform suburban synagogue that is the most classical Reform and the most suburban synagogue you can imagine.
More kippots than they've ever seen.
Yes, all of them are wearing kippot. Nobody in the congregation's wearing a kippah. Nobody. The rabbis don't wear a kippah there. And I could see each of them come in, and so I'm sitting up on, it's a very high bima, and I could see them each come in. They came in separately at staggered times. They sat in different places in the congregation. They made it really, really an attempt to not, but you could pick out these 8 gay Jews from New York just sitting there. I'm thinking, oh my God, okay, but they're really trying hard, which I really appreciated. Truthfully, I fell in love with CBST because I fell in love with the search committee. I mean, I wasn't sure I wanted to do this, but it was really the search committee and the process. And to see how hard they were working to blend in, and let's just say they could not blend in. And I remember and they wouldn't talk to me that night, and I said, please don't, schmooze with me so people hear, just Try to be, stealth about it. Oh my God. And the next time I met with you guys, I think next week, I can't remember, but I asked how did it go, and Art told me that they had conversations about what to say when people at the Oneg would come up to them and say, hello, how are you, who are you? They'd all come up with, backstories. And so I said, so how did it go? They said not a single person spoke to them.
Classical
Unlike
reform.
CBST.
So there's an additional piece that I think is important to put in here, and that is the belief of what would happen to that poor first rabbi who came to CBST. And, there's something in the book about it, but it was bigger than that.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, nobody thought that anybody had a chance in hell of staying here more than a year and a half to two. Okay?
Yeah, you're quoted in the book, actually.
Yeah, well, at that international conference, there was a seminar on choosing a rabbi. And one of the few rabbis who was actually employed by a gay synagogue, Denise Egger.
She's retiring this year.
Yeah, she was leading the thing, and she was talking with me at the end, and she said, well, good luck on your search, but the first rabbi that CBST is not going to last more than a year. She said, your congregation has a reputation, that it's very, very, lots of conflict, lots of anger, all this kind of stuff. They're not going to last. And so were we going to be picking a sacrificial lamb? I don't know. But I was hopeful that we would have someone who would come in and who would figure the whole thing out and figure out how to tame this group.
Yeah,
And-
it was the Wild West. There's
Yeah.
no question. There were board meetings that lasted 6-7 hours. Okay? Yeah, believe me.
And I always tried, at board meetings, I always tried to not lose my temper.
Yeah.
But once Artie Strickler so provoked me that I started screaming at him. Totally out of character. I think he was frightened that I was screaming at him. But, the board meetings could be awful. They were almost as bad as my co-op board meetings. I was president of my co-op for a while.
Well,
And the sponsor of our co-op was sort of the Artie Strickler of our board, so constantly pulling things. But once we had decided that Sharon was our number one candidate, we wanted to achieve unanimity. And so we said, let's call her for one more interview. So she was the only candidate that got 3 interviews, and I'm told this is unusual to have 3 interviews. But we wanted to be sure.
And each interview was 3 hours.
Yeah. We wanted to be sure.
we served
And
food.
Yes.
And we were sure, and so I contacted Mel. I said, we've got a candidate. He said, just one? Because the board thought that they were going to get a choice, that we were going to give them 2 or 3. We were going to just tell them, people we found is superbly qualified, now it's your turn. But we didn't want to do that because we thought that would turn it to be much too political. We wanted to do it by consensus, and we agreed to this person as our choice to recommend. And we said, now the ball's in your park, because under the law, and I had been counsel to the board for years, I became very familiar with the Religious Corporation Law of New York. The congregation had to vote to approve the contract with the rabbi. So I said, now it's your job to decide whether you'll accept our recommendation and will convince the congregation to hire the person we've recommended. So the ball was back in their court. And there were meetings, and the rabbi was invited. There were chances for people to talk with her in different groups. It was a very intensive process. I think we put together 3 or 4 days of activities and meeting with every aspect of the congregation. And at the end, the congregation was convinced. That doesn't mean that everyone was convinced. It means that the overwhelming majority of people were convinced that this was a person that we would be happy to have as our rabbi, as our first rabbi, and let's see how it works. And here she is 30 years later. So
You did good.
it worked pretty well. And I have to commend the members of the committee that there were no leaks, as far as I know. That no one, people probably could figure out who one of the candidates was. But apart from that, I don't think anyone had a clue.
You have set the bar incredibly high for this next search committee, is all I'm going to say. Thank you, obviously, for your work. I want to spend a minute talking about the congregational reaction and how you handled it. Now, both in terms of how you let people know what you were doing as the process was unfolding, right? And all within the cone of the confidentiality, but also how you managed all the blowback. I mean, from the way you talk about it, and certainly the stories that I've heard, it was the Wild West, and there was a lot of anger, there were a lot of unhappy people, and there was a lot of vindictiveness going on. So how did you as a committee handle that in terms of managing to stay positive and move forward and have a good effect?
I think one of the things to realize that if you can put yourself back to 1990, okay, which is hard, as a gay person, there weren't a lot of places you could be that felt like home. And so the congregation became so important to everybody who was a part of it, okay? And we knew we wanted to stay together. We just didn't know quite how to do that in many ways. But I think the brilliance of Mel was to keep bringing it back to that point, that this is our congregation. We need to figure out how to deal with all of these different issues, okay? Everybody is not going to be happy, but we will figure out a way to deal with, in particular, the biggest issues, I think, had to do with AIDS and with the ritual that we had at the community, because people really differed in what they wanted for that.
And I think, I don't even remember how this was achieved, but I think the word went out, don't ask the members of the committee about what they're doing.
Right.
So I gave progress reports, I think in the newsletter. I think I gave a few progress reports in the newsletter. I said, you know, we've interviewed candidates and we're vetting people, we're talking to references, you know, we're doing all the due diligence that you would normally do in a professional hiring process. And I had some acquaintance with that because as a faculty member at New York Law School beginning in 1982, law school faculty are in the hiring business. We were normally hiring new professors every year as people were retiring or leaving. And so I was used to interviewing candidates. I was used to looking at resumes, and I felt that we could handle this. And there wasn't a lot of blowback to us. I mean, you know, we tossed the ball to the board, and it was up to the board. And so it was Mel who did a masterful job of leading us through that process of devising that long weekend, or I think it was a 3-day weekend or a 4-day weekend, where everyone who wanted to meet our candidate had a chance to meet our candidate and to ask questions and to satisfy themselves. And then we had a congregational meeting, and the congregational meeting voted to hire the rabbi. And then she did a brilliant thing. Maybe this is something they teach you in rabbi school. She said, I need to have a rabbi liaison committee of members of the congregation
No,
that I can meet
CBST
with.
had maybe the first rabbi liaison committee.
Oh, you invented
Yeah.
it? Well, that was brilliant. She said she wanted me to chair it, and we put a bunch of people. Some people were on the board, some people were committee chairs, or people who were active in the religious leadership. And we met on a regular basis, and she could talk to us. Everything was confidential within the committee. Talk about what's going on, occasionally coming in and saying, you know, we have to do this, and we have to do that. She was pretty firm about certain things. And we supported her. She had her support group.
And it was a place when people did complain that we could discuss it, evaluate,
Right.
and have some way to evaluate the complainer, whether there was, and maybe things needed to be fine-tuned or shifted, or maybe we needed to say, it was a great container to say, if you have a complaint, it can go to this place, and then we'll discuss it. And some things were legitimate, and some were
Yeah.
less legitimate. There was a lot of gender issues when I came, too.
Right.
And on the committee, were there a lot of discussions about whether you're going to be hiring an LGBT person or a man or a woman? Did that come up a lot in the committee?
It certainly did at the beginning, okay?
Not once we saw a lot of candidates.
Right, right. Once we saw candidates, we realized that it had to be the person. It really had to be the person.
It had to be the individual, and that it had to be someone. I mean, the idea is when you bring in a big change like this of having a full-time paid rabbi, obviously things are going to change. but the speed with which they change has to be moderate so that people can absorb it. And the rabbi has to adapt to the congregation to some extent, just as the congregation has to adapt to the rabbi. And we had a rabbi who came in and was very sensitive to that.
Yes.
So, you know, there was change, and it was gradual over time. Some of the things that I miss, I used to lead services. Jack will remember, once or twice a year I was leading services or giving a drush or something, and then at some point, the amount of that just had to be reduced because the rabbi was going to be on the bima 3 times a month, and then there were the rabbinical interns and the assistant.
I mean, this is a whole
Yeah,
other issue,
right.
which is job description related,
Right.
but the original contract with me was that I would be on the bima once a month.
Right.
You know, and
At
I was.
least once a month.
Once a month, right. No, and I said to the board, you're kind of wasting your money. That's one of the things that I can do, you know, maybe we should, but it was that was a little bit of a struggle because I just, obviously I love doing the pastoral stuff, but I also felt like I should have a presence on the bima, and that was after Jack remembers all of this, we went through all that together.
And we evolved, and, you know, now we have professional leadership on the bima just about every Friday night. And one of the things was we had a very good service, I think. I mean, I brought my father, who grew up in an Orthodox home, when I'd been coming to the congregation for a few months, and he said, "This is an Orthodox service." Yeah.
Yes. And then
We had our own prayer book, you know, but it was a little blue folder with mimeograph pages and our photocopy pages. But I think we should probably open it up.
Yeah, so let's open it up to the community here, and Sharon, if you could gather questions from the Zoom. Who's in the back there? I don't see who you are, I just see a hand.
Michael
Oh,
Levine.
Michael Levine, I can't see his face, he's blocked. Michael Levine.
Yeah. Here.
Thank you very much for this program. I remember working with this committee, and I remember the outstanding job you did, and I really need to congratulate you on the hard work you did. I was one of the members of the congregation who came to hear Rabbi Kleinbaum speak at the World Congress of Gay and Lesbian Jewish Organizations, and there were quite a few of us there, and I recall turning to Mark Bieber, who has passed away, who was one of our past chairs, and I said, "Mark," and I did not know that she was a potential candidate. And I said, "We need to get the word back to the committee to tell them that we saw an excellent rabbi who should be considered." And Mark looked at me and said, "She's already under consideration." So I thank the committee. The committee did a fantastic job, and I really think that you deserve the credit of everyone in this congregation.
Yeah. She hadn't applied yet, but
And by the way, I included that drosh for my 10th anniversary, when we did a collection of 10 sermons from my 10th anniversary. I included that drosh in the book because so many people remembered it and heard it as their first drosh of mine. So that's actually in the book for those who would like to see it. It's very interesting for me to analyze the ways I've changed since that sermon. It's a very dense sermon.
I just want to emphasize, as Roseanne and Art have, how crucial Mel Rosen was to this whole process. And you have to put it in context, which was he had been the founder of the executive director of the New York State AIDS Institute. Yes. He was one of the people involved in founding GMHC. He
was the first unpaid, but first executive director of GMHC.
Yeah. He had a partner who was an ordained conservative rabbi who wasn't out, and he was dying of AIDS. And all at the same...
Hold the mic so the Zoom people...
All at the same time, and he managed to hold it together. He was the person who sold the whole concept to the congregation, which was not exactly running to follow. I think we all understood that the pastoral piece was important, and the question was, do we really need a rabbi to take care of the pastoral piece? And Mel had an MSW, so you would have, that was of some confidence that he thought we needed a rabbi. But he really, by force of personality, and I do not minimize Mel's force of person. Mel was a personality. In addition to being a big person, he was a personality. And and it is really hasn't gotten enough credit historically here for, for having having sold the concept of having a rabbi and put the process together that brought Rabbi Kleinbaum here.
He's very well featured in the book, though. That's the
Yes,
good
he
news.
is.
He is very well honored
And
in
Rabbi
the book.
Cohen does a fantastic job of giving him the credit he's due in the book.
And we should say, I officiated at his funeral 30 days after I started at CBST. And when I visited him in the hospital during that month, he was in serious decline, obviously. And he said it was very moving. And he said to me, this was my dream to have a rabbi. And he knew many rabbis, not to mention his partner was a rabbi with whom I'm still in contact. He now lives in Southern California. But he said, I want you to do the funeral. And it's very important. And even he was thinking organizationally then. He was saying, I need to show the congregation that you are now the CBST rabbi. I mean, he was even thinking organizationally what it would mean. And we did his funeral at Bethune Street.
I think it was the first time we had a funeral.
Peter Vogel before me. But that was,
Margot Carl, that was a memorial
yeah.
service. Okay.
But Peter Vogel, I was told,
I don't think it.
well, whatever, okay, now we're,
Not a funeral.
but yeah, so his funeral was on September 1st of 1992.
Sabrina, you make the choice. Where's the microphone go?
Hi. You may recall I have some strong personal experience in the conflict between the Strickler wing and the, mainstream non-Strickler wing of the synagogue. Maybe that could be a whole nother discussion, but I'm interested in, well, we know the Strickler, well, Artie at least himself very much tried to undermine our rabbi when she came in. You've told interesting stories about that. I'm interested in Marvin's role on the committee because he was there to represent that wing. And how did he play that position? Because did he know that his friends weren't going to support anybody, or how?
No, he was a member of the committee who contributed. And I don't remember him as being a particularly outspoken member of the committee or, filibustering against what we wanted to do. He entered in a very professional way and participated, and we came
And he
to
was
our consensus.
always very gracious to me
Yeah.
after I was hired. He was always very appropriate, gracious, lovely person to be person.
I don't know. I don't know what he said to them when our recommendation came out, but he must have said to them it was a unanimous thing, and I voted for it because she was the best candidate, and I thought that she was someone who would be good for our congregation.
Yeah, but you're right, that wing did not accept me, and that was a long struggle for
And that
many
was
years.
the separate group that met down at
Well, and that was
at
later
Bethune
when
Street,
we
later,
moved to
when we
Bethune
moved,
Street. But even
yeah.
that first year when I was at CBST, they were very much against me. And some people left the synagogue that year. Jack Greenberg, who was also on the committee.
Yes. I don't remember even one instance of dissension on that committee. We all got along so perfectly. We might disagree on a point, but it was respectful, and we came in, some of us knowing each other better than others, some of us were friends, but not everybody, and we just really, I think, bonded so well. I don't remember anything negative about the whole time we worked together, and I'm a veteran of many, many committees at CBST, and I can't say that about any other committee. But that was just a fantastic experience, really was.
Jack, do you remember how the committee decided which questions to ask? I'm very curious about that. I've never gotten to ask anybody. Because I was asked some of the most, part of what I loved about the process was I loved the questions I got. They really had depth to them.
The questions when we interviewed
Yes.
people, I think we had discussed ahead of time and tried to make sure everybody would get a chance to ask something. So there was an issue with a question you really didn't like. That you felt was personal and shouldn't be asked. And you lectured us later that we didn't intervene and stop that question. And we all felt we wanted to see how you handled an instance of something like that. And I was, it was good to see how you did that. So.
Especially knowing the synagogue at that time.
Yeah, you knew
It was going to happen.
Yeah, this hand has been up a lot here.
Right after you became our rabbi, do you remember the Salute to Israel parade problem? So the year before, I was the chair of the Salute to Israel Parade Committee, and we were rejected. The woman was Gloria Kaufman, and she used to come to look at our children and our daycare, our nursery, Hebrew school and everything, and we didn't have anything. So then right after you came in, it was like a month or two.
No, it was the spring of '93. I came in the summer of '92, but the Salute to Israel Day Parade
But
is
we were already meeting during that time, and I
Yeah.
remember feeling so glad to turn it over, and felt so bad that, the New York Post had the cover, Oy Gay, instead of Oy Vey, and then it says, now the gays want to march. And this took CBST from like nothing to boom, and this was like one of your first Into the Fires.
that was quite a year. Jerry?
I'm conscious that all of the questions have been from men. But we have another question.
Mine is really a process question. All this great experience you have, are you passing it on to whoever's on the next search committee? And particularly, I was curious about the questionnaire that nobody wants to talk about.
Well, it may be that once you've composed a search committee, we should meet with them before they get started.
Absolutely. One of my questions to you is going to be, if you could give one piece of advice to the incoming search committee based on your experience, what would that advice be?
My advice would be to be very flexible and to be open to discovery and not to assume that what you anticipate is what you're going to get. And that ultimately you're trying to find somebody who is going to function in a very sensitive way and adjust themselves to the congregation as the congregation adjusts to them. That is, you don't want an authoritarian personality. You don't want a traditional old-fashioned pulpit rabbi who my word is the law, that sort of thing. You want someone who's going to be persuasive. And that, forget about strict criteria. Go for the person, because the person is who you're going to be dealing with for years and years, if you're successful, for decades. And so we went for the person. Other people had more extensive resumes and criteria and everything. We had people who had been pulpit rabbis for decades. And at first we thought experience was going to be very, very important. But then we thought, no, relating to our congregation is going to be very important.
The fit was really important. Yeah. I think the only thing I would add to what Art is saying is, I think people go into the situation with a preconceived notion of what they're looking for or what would be acceptable or what wouldn't be acceptable. And I think you need to leave all of that, plus all egos, at the door, okay? People really have to be able to be honest and say what they're feeling. And a lot of this is feeling, okay? It's not the CV. It's, I think
Roseanne, could you just hold it up a little closer to you?
Yeah, I think the difference between Sharon and the other candidates was the comfort level, okay? And she is comfortable with gay people.
Didn't I put that in the questionnaire?
And on that note, the rabbi is comfortable with you.
Yeah. There's a guy over there who's been trying to talk.
Hi, so Rabbi Kleinbaum, when you make a friend, there's always that magic moment. You see a movie, you go to dinner, and then you think, oh, I've made a friend. And I remember with you, I met you, when you first came on board and told you my name. And I remember like 3 months, 4 months later, you spoke to me again and you remembered my name. And I was simply in shock because I'm terrible with names. So, and that's when I said, wow, it's like that special magic something, I guess. And in addition to everything else you say, when was your magic moment with our congregation? Like, when did you feel, did it take a month? Did it take 10 years? Or what was can you describe it? Or was
That's a
it gradual?
great question. That's a great question. And I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. As I mentioned before, it was really engaging with the search committee, because the search committee was such and I have a lot to say about the search process from the point of view of the rabbi that we won't get to tonight, but the one thing I will say is that this was a very unusual search committee. And from the point of view of the rabbi, first of all, the deep respect and thoughtfulness, and Roseanne and Art were the contact people. There was nobody else. There wasn't any process other than to be in touch by phone or by mail, mostly by phone. So the way that I was treated was just remarkable. It just was deep and thoughtful, and it wasn't just professional. There was a real deep engagement. And I just fell in love with how deep the questions were that I got on the search committee. And the questions were so, I just loved the range of who CBST was from the search committee I got, from the kinds of questions. And I do come from a very traditional background, so I do care about very traditional Jewish practices, and I know a lot about them, but I'm also, a lesbian of my age, which then was a lot younger. I sometimes lose my breath working with our interns and our assistant rabbi and our cantor when I realize, wow, I am not that age anymore. You know that feeling when you think, wow, that's not? Oh, yeah. So this process was a 2-year process. So when I started, I think I first applied in 91. I think in the summer of 91 was when I first, I was late. You started in 1990. I didn't apply till 91. I was 32 years old. And so I was cutting edge, which is pretty funny. Stop laughing, Marcia. So I think I have to start by saying it was really the search committee, the quality of the people. I just loved these people, and I realized the questions that I have about life, about Judaism, about meaning and purpose, these were the same questions that this group of 8 people had. So I felt like I want to explore those questions. I don't have the answers, but I want to be in a community that's exploring those questions and these are the same questions I'm interested in. So that was very meaningful to me. So I have to really say it started with this search committee, with these 2 human beings, and Jack and the others. It was very energizing. I'd come back from these 3-hour search committee interviews energized because it was so exciting. Even when we had this little fight because one of them asked me personal questions, which I said wasn't appropriate. And to give you a sense, this is what I mean. After I was hired, the person who asked that question that became the big kerfuffle, made an appointment to meet with me, came into my office, and he said, I really want you to understand that I need to apologize. That was inappropriate. I shouldn't have done that. I'm an older generation, blah, blah, blah. Just who does that? And he came, this is after I was already hired. I could have been, he said, it's bothered me all these months that I even did that, and I'm so, and now I'm very, very, very close to him. So these are amazing. CBST is made up of amazing human beings, and the search committee was, a dugma. They were all examples of that. So I really have to say that's where, I didn't need to come to a congregation. I never thought I'd be a congregational rabbi. I thought congregations were boring. I thought, remember in that generation and that time, we were all that way. We all didn't like rabbis, right? I was the same. I didn't want organized Jewish life. It was so insipid, right? I came out of the 60s, and so to find a congregation of people who were, I shared their concern about, authority figures. Remember, the time was we were all against authority, coming from a moment of where Jewish authority figures had been abusive. So I felt like my questions were their questions, and together we could kind of work on figuring it all out together. But I have a lot more to say about the arc of the time I was here, but that, I have to say, that's where I fell in love. And I did fall in love. And I've stayed in love, by the way. That's the amazing thing. I've stayed in love all these years.
I guess this sort of goes along with what you were just saying, but did you have, when you first took the job,
Yeah.
did you have a vision or a couple of thoughts about what exactly you wanted to do in terms of where you wanted to take the synagogue at the time?
Yes and no. I mean, I had gotten some very good advice because I had never been a congregational rabbi before, except as a student. I was for 3 years the student rabbi of the gay synagogue in Atlanta, Georgia. But it meant I flew in, I flew out. You know, it's not, you know, you're an intern, it's not very different. But that's where I got a lot of experience dealing with AIDS as a rabbi because they were, you know, dying all the time. And I worked on the AIDS hotline. And to give you, is Eliza here? So Eliza, I don't know if I've ever told you this story since Eliza is a student at RRC now. I went every Thursday night. I was in rabbinical school from 85 to 90. So we're talking about the height of, it was a bad time. Every Thursday night I went to the Philadelphia AIDS hotline and volunteered there. And I got training as a hotline answerer. And guess what? For those of us who were around then, there was not much we could say to people, right? There wasn't. But it was a way of having some comfort, I did not tell anybody at RRC what I was doing. So imagine RRC now, right? Because I thought it would out me as a lesbian if people heard that I was volunteering at an AIDS hotline. That's how the straight world completely was disengaged with AIDS, certainly in the Jewish community, a little bit better in some of the Christian denominations, but that's what the world was like. You know, that was how intensely, see now, what was the question? Vision. Right? So.
As soon as you came, did you want to have a chorus?
Yeah, well, if you read the installation drash that I gave, which is really, it's been kind of the roadmap. These were dreams. It wasn't like I thought, okay, then we move this piece there. But I knew that music is very, 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 very important to me. I knew that CBST, the gay synagogue in New York City, should have great music. And I don't mean adequate music. I mean, you know, should be absolutely the best. I knew that. And so in that drash that I gave at my installation, which was September 11th, 1992, September 11th has come to mean other things, I outlined the things I thought we needed to start dealing with children, and although there were no kids then, arts and music, and what? Okay, your kids were born the day I started at CBST. So they're kind of like my rings on a tree, how I know how long I've been here. I see how big those kids are. They were literally born, right? Was it August 1st or 2nd or August 2nd? August 3rd? Okay. It's not good that you're arguing about the birth of your children. August 3rd, your kids were born. Okay. So there were a few kids. There weren't a lot of kids, but they were just born. So yes, I did understand. I didn't know exactly, but I had this great advice for the first year I was here to be a historian of the synagogue and to express my love for the synagogue and not to make a lot of changes then, because I didn't know. And I listened. I had parlor sessions all year long. Some of you remember. I don't know if Regina Linder is here. She helped to organize them. I had 2 a month where I listened. What? And I was there with a pad and paper, and I listened to people. People went around the room. And the first year, people had a lot of pain about how mistreated they were by this committee, how mistreated they were by Artie Strickler. That was a big theme. You know, how much they didn't like this person, and there was a lot of pain. And I felt my first year, besides the AIDS stuff, which was constant, as Art indicated, I felt like my job the first year was to be a container for people's pain about CBST. And that pain about CBST wasn't really just about CBST. It was about being gay people who were lost at sea, who were in a lot of stress for all different reasons. And I just sat there with a pad of paper and just wrote it down. And things started coming to me. As I started listening to people, ideas would come out of that. And most of the ideas that I then developed, programming for, I did have these ideas, and I knew that we needed to go towards having programming for kids, social justice stuff, music and arts, and developing our prayer life to be more expansive. But a lot of it came out of my listening to people, you know, and I did that for a couple of years, and then the pain started dissipating, and people started having ideas also themselves. You know, like Mike Feinsilver, I remember, came to me and said, you know, retreats are really important to me in other parts of my life, and especially in recovery programs. Why doesn't CBST have a retreat? So I said, okay, let's have a retreat. And guess what? That wasn't my idea. It was a congregant who came to me and said, why don't we do retreats? And I was able to, whatever you call it, you know, make it happen. And now retreats are like a really important part of the life of the synagogue. Is it this weekend? Yes. Oh my God. So next weekend, Mike Feinsilver came up to me and said, why don't we do retreats? And it was a dynamic relationship that way. All right, let's just see. It's very late, but let's just see if there are any questions from Zoom, and then we're going to have to end.
Yes, sorry, we don't have a microphone up here.
I can hear you, though. I'll repeat it.
Yolanda had a lovely comment. She said she remembers Boris Kay's first day when she strolled in wearing shorts, T-shirt, and her red high-top sneakers, carrying a rug for her office.
Yeah. Sharon just saying Yolanda is saying she remembers my first day because the office was barely built. It was the old library down at Bethune Street, and I carried in a rug because I took a rug from my home because there was no rug there, and it was really an ugly floor, shall we say. Bethune Street was it had very deep spiritual and holy energy, but it was not, one could say, beautiful. Yes? Was there enough money to pay the rabbi a living wage? Not really. But that was part of the process. Things had to change over the course of time. But there were no dues before I came. The dues,
$50.
$50 a year. What? Very minor dues. Right, very minor dues. All right, I know this is late, but I want to thank you both so much. Jack Greenberg. And it's so meaningful to be discussing this as we're looking back and knowing that you all and Jack and the other members of the committee have created a foundation for now the future. So thanks everybody for coming. Be mitzvah tomorrow morning, 10 a.m.